okay, I can see why people might mistake us for a cult because some of these things but we know we're not a cult. So we would literally have conversations about saying, all right, well, we know people think we're a cult. We know we're not, but we should minimize our cult-like behavior to the public so that will make our lives easier.
Spit that shit out, man! Now it's on flip script.
Hoyt Richards joining us today. And I have to say thanks to our mutual friend Joel West, who introduced us several years ago before we even were doing this podcast. And then it came back around and be like such a great guest to have. Hoyt, thanks for joining us, man.
No, it's my pleasure.
Hoyt,
and shout out to Joel.
Absolutely. A good friend and a guy who's introduced me not only to you, but to at least one other really, really great experience in life. He's a good friend. Hoyt, you've got an interesting story. So I kind of want to just lay it out, start to lay it out and then hand it off to you.
Okay, sure.
Hoyt, the height of your career would have been what, in the 80s and early 90s, or
I'd say mid 90s is when I was kind of peaking. Yeah.
Okay. And you were, and don't be humble. From what I've gathered, you were, if not the top, one of the top male models in the world.
Yes, that's correct. If you believe what you read on the internet, yes, that would be accurate.
Right. Living, I'm sure, a very interesting, fun, living the high life.
Yeah, it's what's crazy about the male modeling thing is the way I can describe it for the guys who went through it. It was a fraternity of sorts because it's a very odd experience being a guy basically in a woman's job, and so I can say from a guy's point of view, I know what it feels like to be sexually discriminated against in the job place. And I really empathize with women that deal with that in virtually almost every other profession. So it's an interesting perspective to gain from being in a job and recognizing that you can show up and put the same hours in and the same effort, and the pay is just never going to be the same.
Is that really where it manifested itself? Was in the pay, or was it also clear on set who has the power and who doesn't?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, right. It was a combination of all of that. I mean, it was the woman's market kind of drives that industry of fashion and cosmetics and all that. As a female model, you could make $50 million in a year. A guy, the top guy, maybe you can make $1 million.
Right.
So and listen, $1 million is nothing to fluff your head off about, but that's quite a difference in pay scale, and it's attributed to the demands and supply of the industry. I mean, as a male model, you could not get a $5 million cosmetic contract, and the girls could get that. Now, the benefit of all of that was within the guys' industry, it was much more of a, like I was saying, a fraternity feeling, because there wasn't a lot of competition, because it wasn't as if you were fighting each other out for this huge campaign or this huge cosmetic thing that was going to change your life. That didn't exist. So we were just all kind of somehow caught up in this by various ways that we found ourselves in that business, and found ourselves in Europe and going around and doing things that you would never get to do, largely being paid on someone else's dime. And that was just this incredible experience. And I still got a lot of great friends from those years, because you don't really, it's very hard to explain to someone after you've done that what that was like without them looking at you sideways, like saying that's impossible.
Well, Hoyt,
so
how did you get into that business?
It wasn't intentional, really. The crazy thing is the guy who first really proposed me doing it was the cult leader.
Which is right. So there's the cat out of the bag. At the same time that you are possibly the top male model in the world, there's something else going on in your life.
Yeah. I mean, I can certainly say that I lived a bit of a double life in that sense, and I certainly experienced that. So yeah, the guy who I met up in Nantucket, and that was where my family summers every year, and I'll be there in 2 weeks to hang with my dad and my siblings, and it's a very nostalgic and very treasured place in our family history, so to speak. My dad actually went up to Nantucket to see my mother when they were dating on their third date, and actually proposed to her on that date. I think it was clearly a different time, and she first responded by saying, "Well, how many children do you want?" My dad said, "Well, I think 4." And she's like, "At least 4." And we had 6. And then, and she said, "You also have to promise that we come back every summer here to Nantucket." And my father has fulfilled that.
That's nice.
Hoyt, I like your mom already. She's setting the terms right off the bat.
There you go.
That's a smart woman.
She knew what you wanted, and she was definitive and clear. And so Nantucket was always the summer destination. It's something that, in retrospect, I would have never imagined that going to the beach one day at 16 with my buddies, as we would do every day, and having this guy, Frederick von Mears, whose original name was Freddie Myers, but he had somewhere, one of his friends said somewhere on the ferry ride over from Cape Cod, he became Frederick von Mears, Dutch descent rather than the Brooklyn Jew he truly was.
Right.
And he put his towel down next to mine. And I had heard a bit about this guy. In a sense, he had been vetted by my other peer group, as they had encounters with him, and said that he was interesting. He's a bit out there, he's into this kind of Eastern philosophy and kind of a throwback maybe to the hippies. And so when he sat down next to me and started to engage me in a conversation, which was very kind of highfalutin for my taste at that time, in the sense of not things I would normally talk to someone about kind of Eastern philosophy and astrology and ancient civilizations. It was quite, enamoring to me, because I had some interest in those sort of things, but never really had engaged in any sort of real conversation about it. And he was talking to me very much as if I was an adult, which I think any teenager appreciates. And he was very effective, I can say now, looking back, at some of the techniques he used to engage that conversation. Like he would front a statement by saying, "Well, you're very smart, so you'll understand this," and then go into something. And then, of course, it always sounds complimentary to hear that, but it's a really powerful influence technique, because you don't feel you can contradict someone once they've already given you this compliment that you should understand it.
And Hoyt, so was he already running an organization, then the leader of the organization, when you met him?
That's a great question, Britton. And what I tell people is I actually experienced this group, which became a cult, literally like a startup, in the sense that I got in on the ground floor, where it was really just a narcissist and an entourage that ultimately I watched before me become a cult.
Okay.
So I got to see the soup to nuts version of how these things happen, which is one of the reasons I like to share my story, because I want it to be a bit of not only a cautionary tale, but a teaching tool for those who just have questions of wondering how these things happen. And I think it's also really important to humanize the cult leader from the point of view of, you can't just focus on the end game of what they became or some of the crazy things that came out of their mouths, and just focus on all the negatives, because all the characteristics and behavior that this guy exhibited, and not that I can say with total confidence I can get inside his head and know exactly what he was thinking. That's impossible. But I studied up a lot on cults and mind control and influence techniques, and these type of ways of manipulation. And so I can pretty much understand that his pathology emerges at a very young age through some wounds that he experienced, whether it was a form of abuse or abandonment. But he had, without question, an attachment disorder, in the sense that by not getting the love and attention that you would want in a normal childhood, he was born, I only found this out recently, actually, but he was born to a 16-year-old unwed woman. She then had another child, I think with the same man, a couple of years later, and then she eventually got married and had two more daughters. Now, when I met him, Freddie, he claimed that his parents were orphaned at 4, and that he was brought up by his godmother or great grandmother. I can't remember, but that that he had gone through this horrible kind of childhood, and he was now off trying to make his mark, kind of as this spiritual teacher. And so he completely fabricated a new history for himself. And he went from being Freddie Myers to Freddie von Mears, and he came from Brooklyn, but he had a very effective kind of a posh accent that he had kind of created, and was fascinated with the social register and all, which I didn't even know existed at that time. I mean, social register, I'm like, well, what is that? But so he was very into the aristocracy and people of any sort of position or influence. And so when I met him at 16, he was still in his very social period of where he was virtually throwing a party every night on Nantucket. And at my age, I just saw it as an opportunity to just get free beer. I mean, that was, that's all. That was the main focus of my life at that time: playing football and drinking beer and chasing girls. So it was, my initial impression of meeting him was not some sort of full court press of him trying to get me involved. He just seemed friendly and very active at wanting to have the social scene. And I can say, a little bit looking back now, that these type of personalities, they draw confidence in themselves by who they can attach themselves with or who associate themselves with. It's kind of like, they draw their pride from the people they surround themselves with. So he also had a technique of being able to compliment you in such a way that was on a largely exaggerated scale. So even when he'd introduce you, he'd kind of play up that you were kind of more than who you really were. Mm-hmm. And that's a double-edged sword. It's kind of nice to be introduced with someone who's speaking so highly of you, but you also know it's an exaggeration and a bit of fabrication. But that's kind of how he operated. So it's an interesting kind of network to get pulled into. And I really just would only see him at the summers. And I really didn't get actively involved in the group, and didn't even realize he had like a true following until I got to college, which wasn't until like when I was 18, 19 in New Jersey. And I knew he was based in Manhattan, and he invited me to come in and see him in Manhattan and join his friends and go to Studio 54. And that was like the second wave of this is the early 80s now at that time, of Studio 54. And so from my point of view, I thought I was working this guy. I thought, I can get my friends, we'll go up there, we can crash at his place, we go to 54. This is a great situation that I'm benefiting from. So it was kind of a strange indoctrination from that point, in the sense that it wasn't this full court press that I felt I was being asked to really kind of make a decision of whether I was in or out. It was kind of a slow burning evolution.
It seems like a lot of those, child predators do similar things with the grooming yes. people, and not just their victims, but the community, but also the slow burn too. It's methodical.
The best analogy I've heard is how you boil a frog. If you throw a frog in hot water, it'll pop right out. But if you put a frog in room temperature water and incrementally turn up the heat, it will stay in there till it boils. So that's kind of the process, I think, is. Now there are other groups that do more of a full court press. Scientology does that. EST and the Forum. They do those sort of things where they bring you in for a weekend and they really hit you hard. And you can reframe someone's mind in about 48 hours if you know what you're doing. And so it can happen fast. It just wasn't in my case. It was really for me that when I went through an identity crisis, which was I was playing football at college and having a grand old time. All my roommates were football players, and then I kept having these partial dislocations with my shoulders, and it got to be really bad. Where I thought, maybe I need to get an operation, and the team doctor trainer basically said, I think you need to kind of hang up your spikes here. And I wasn't ready to hear that. So I went up to New York to see a shoulder specialist. And it was on that trip that I reconnected with Freddie and all of that. And I found out from the doctor, he said, yeah, we can, this is like my junior year in college. So he said, we can operate, and I think I can solve this issue. You basically stretched your ligaments. I'd done a lot of gymnastics and rings and those type of things. So I'd stretched the ligaments, because to do the rings, you've got to do that. You literally partially dislocate your shoulders when you do certain moves on the rings. And it was not very well set up for tackling. I had always played offense much more in high school. And when I got to college, they switched me to defensive back, and the tackling was just, literally I would make a strong tackle. My whole arm would go numb, and I'd literally be in the huddle trying to shake it back to life before the next play. And I'm like, I can't do this like this. This is not going to be good. So I go through the doctor, and he basically says that he can operate, but he couldn't guarantee full mobility, meaning he goes, the way the muscle might heal, you might not be able to have full extension over your head when you finish. And I said, well, I have to have full extension if I'm going to block passes and he said, well, he goes, I just can't guarantee it. So basically I was hit with this crossroads of, what am I going to do if I don't play football? And that was kind of when Freddie said, listen, I'm telling you, you could be a model, you could be an actor, you could do all these things. And he actually was friends with the guy, Joey Hunter, who was the head of Ford Models men's department. And he sent me in to see Joey. And that's, it wasn't as simple as that, but more or less it kind of started that from there.
Was Joey part of this whole thing, or did he just?
No, Joey just knew him from the modeling days.
Okay.
It's one of these things, like, I think it's important when you tell a story like this to kind of fill in the context, because in the 80s, there was really kind of a pushback on most of the kind of standard religion. People were not kind of into the very kind of standard Christian approach. So there was a lot of investigation into alternative type of things. The New Age movement kind of started then. Yoga was just starting. Health food was just starting. It was this whole kind of push. So the fact that Freddie was into these things wasn't like some crazy anomaly. So it wouldn't set off a red flag for most people, because everybody was kind of checking out something, and everyone was kind of into something. So even when I was getting more and more involved with the group, and was starting to read some of the Hindu Vedas and some of the philosophy and things that we so-called espouse, it wasn't like what I was saying was anything out of the ordinary of what I heard other people who were also looking into different things saying. So it's one of the misleading things about cults is the information that you're getting exposed to normally is incredibly valid. I mean, if you look at the maybe 10,000 cults they track today that are active, probably over 80% of them are Bible-based. So you can't say the Bible's the problem, because the Bible's a very legitimate religious scripture. Ultimately, what's dangerous is the potential interpretation of those scriptures, and more importantly, how that plays out in behavior, which is quite often kind of the antithesis, or certainly hypocritical to the so-called principles that you're kind of reading about. The behavior of the group sometimes doing something very different, but because you get exposed through the actual information, which is legit, and you kind of have this kind of inspiration that you can kind of receive from reading some of these great texts, that all gets projected onto the group and the person who introduced you to this information. And you try to kind of see it all from that lens, but very often it doesn't fit. So you start asking some questions, and that's never received very well. They'll put up with it initially with the understanding that you're new, but eventually it's like, look, dude, just shut up. Like, look at all the people been here a lot longer than you have. They're going along, and like you'll figure it out, but stop bothering us with these stupid questions. And that's a way that your critical thinking becomes, eroded. You start mistrusting your natural ability to be skeptical and see things. You start thinking that's a problem.
Yeah, this is a very, very common tendency of mind control religions or cult religions, is that dissolution of trusting your own, like you said, Hoyt, critical thinking. And I think so many of these extreme control religions start with a lot of the easy stuff. I mean, in Scientology, what do they start with? They start with a stress test. We want you to be less stressed. The Mormon Church wants you to find happiness through prayer or the teachings of Jesus Christ. And who knows what your cult did, but they start with that. And a lot of the more scary or, head-turning, confusing beliefs are often not even introduced until you've agreed to join membership into the religion. And
that's right.
And like you said, they want to let you believe that they welcome questioning, but that's with the understanding that your questioning must lead you to a certain truth. Of course, you can question. Of course, you can doubt or look at things a little bit.
But here's the truth that you must get to.
But this is the answer you must come to.
Yeah.
And if you're not coming to this answer, then you are doubting too much, or you are thinking
part of the
too
problem.
much, or you don't have enough faith. And so that's a very common tactic across the board.
No, you're spot on, Britt. How did you come to learn all that?
I don't know if you know this, Hoyt, but I grew up Mormon.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Welcome to the club.
Yeah.
You're a cult survivor. I'm giving you a virtual high five and a hug right now.
Seriously, I would love to share a beer with you. I remember once when I was 22 studying Shakespeare in London, another actor, we were walking and talking. Somebody brought up Mormonism. He did not know that I was a member of the church at the time, and he made some snide comment about it being a cult. And I was so deeply offended at the time, because I just thought, how ignorant is he? He doesn't know that we're not a cult. The Mormon church, it's not like that. And I was deeply upset. And while I currently don't believe that the Mormon church enacts within the framework of a cult like something more specific as yours, or something more specific like Scientology, it does embody at least 5 to 7 of the top 10 cult characteristics.
Yes, absolutely.
Mind control, demanding money, etc.
But I mean, it's that defining a cult is so tricky.
That's what I was going to ask, Marty.
The great scholars still haven't. I mean, I had Hoyt, have you ever heard of a woman named Margaret Singer from Berkeley?
Oh, of course. Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
I'd met her and chatted with her and been to some of her seminars. I worked on a joint terrorism task force, and she was talking about domestic extremism and cults and that sort of thing. And it was the hardest thing in the world to get her to. She didn't really have a solid answer for that, and I'm not sure if I'm attributing.
Well, this is what I try to do to explain, because it's very hard to have a definitive one that you feel covers it all, or at least is a working model that seems to apply to more things than not. Because that's what I think is ultimately what we're looking for is to start speaking the same language. If we're not using kind of the same nomenclature, there's a lot of common ground here, but a lot of times it doesn't get used in the same terms. Therefore, a lot of times people don't realize that they're having what I could only call cultic relationships all the time. So that term cultic relationship, and that's usually if the situation is one where I feel like I've got an opportunity to talk about this, I actually find that's a better introduction to describe my experience, is to find some entry into a conversation where I might just, as a side note, say, "Oh, that reminds me of the situation I had when I had this cultic relationship with this group." And people go, "What?" And because I used to say it, when I was in this cult, and what I found was that word cult is so triggering, and the media has really focused on the extreme worst case scenario, whether it's Jonestown or Heaven's Gate or Manson. You have all these horrific kind of images that flash into your mind. That's the hole you now have to dig out of to try to have the conversation I want to have. So I found by framing it as a cultic relationship with a group, that's never an expression that one has generally been exposed to. They're like, well, what does that mean? And that's when I come through and say, well, listen, cultic relationships are actually commonplace, if not really. It seems to be just part of the human condition. And a cultic relationship is a clinical term, and it describes any relationship, which is usually a one-on-one relationship, where that person that you're somehow seeking love and approval from, because you almost unconsciously given away an authoritarian position to them on some level, they are now controlling and abusing you because of that position you've given them. And that is something that can show up in a parent, child relationship with a sibling, a coach, a boss, we always have those relationships where we get involved, which we want so much to make this person happy. And it seems like no matter what we do, it's never enough. No matter how hard we work, we should have been more, better.
So it can be a romantic relationship or a marriage too. It says,
absolutely, right? Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the common ground, is to say, listen, what I went through, albeit a more extreme version of it, it's a great teaching tool, because sometimes if you can understand the dynamics in something that's a little bit more extreme, it allows you to see the more subtle version in your own life. And as I got better at talking about my experience and engaging people who I virtually didn't know, I mean, I quite often brought it up just even in social situations, just to try to pass on some information. And what I found as I got better at telling the story, and because initially my impulse to tell the story was to just allow this conversation to be talked about without people feeling awkward or weird about it. And if I could be the conduit to having a conversation about a topic that a lot of people didn't understand, it would be good, and it would make me feel more comfortable with this part of my history that I didn't want to hide. I didn't necessarily want to be defined by it, but I certainly wanted people to feel comfortable asking me anything about that part of my life. And so that was my main incentive initially. But the silver lining was, as I started telling the story more often and getting better at it, instead of, it's like any sort of good storytelling, like a good movie or something, or a good play, it's not so much you watching something on the screen and saying, oh, that's so amazing. It's that self-reflective moment. You're going, oh my God, this reminds me of something in my life. Like, I totally relate to what's happening here. And you start playing some version of the themes or story that you're witnessing, whatever form it is, in your own life version of that type of scenario. And that's when I realized that this was a much more of a universal condition, because so many people, as I would be talking about, my experience, are going, oh my God, this reminds me of my relationship with my dad, or my lover, or, this guy I'm working with, the boss, or, whatever. And that's when I started to say, okay, this is where I think this needs to be talked about more, and this should be in schools, and this should start to be something that is part of our curriculum of education, because your greatest disadvantage of getting yourself in these situations is to think it can't happen to you. And I was completely guilty of that when I, not unlike what you're describing, Britt, when people heard something about what I was doing and wanted to say something like, I don't know, it sounds a little culty to me. I'd be like, fuck you. You don't think I'd get involved in a cult? Like, fuck. Now, of course, I don't know anything about cults other than, like I said, like those extreme versions of, Jonestown or whatever have you. So my first interaction is like, I'm going to New York, going to Studio 54. No way there's a cult. And the main hook that I've got, making my stance is the arrogance of, coming from a very ignorant point of view of thinking, as long as I'm in the group, that means it can't be a cult, because I would never join a cult.
Interesting.
And that was my main criteria. And even when our group at its kind of worst point was when the cult leader had died, and Vanity Fair had done this like 15-page expose, calling us a cult and saying all these crazy things we were doing. It was overdone in certain areas, like Vanity Fair does, but it was largely accurate. It was, and they were definitely calling us a cult, and it was certainly the worst thing my parents would have ever wanted to read, and that was a whole shitstorm that I was dealing with at home at that time. But I remember within the group, we're all sitting there and all indoctrinated, obviously unknowingly, but we've got our heels dug in, saying, "There's no way we're a cult." And I actually went out and found a book. It wasn't a great book, but I found a book on cults, and I was just like, I said, well, people calling it a cult, let's just see what and I start reading some of the so-called tenets that can be you find in cults, and I'm going, okay, well, we do that, but I know we're not a cult, and I can, so the main thing I gleaned from this, and I shared it with the group, was like, okay, I can see why people might mistake us for a cult, because some of these things but we know we're not a cult. So we would literally have conversations about saying, all right, well, we know people think we're a cult, we know we're not, but we should minimize our cult-like behavior to the public, so that will make our lives easier. And that was kind of the way you rationalize. So it's really remarkable because this is the thing I'm experiencing right now as I start, I'm going down different avenues now to kind of, now that I'm 20 years out from this experience, I feel like I can talk about it and I can tell stories about it. So I've got a couple TV projects in development and things. And what I'm finding is some of the projects has required getting back in touch with a lot of these people that I escaped from. I consciously broke away from this group. I didn't really identify it at the time that it was a cult, but I certainly knew I couldn't stay there anymore. And it wasn't because I perceived what they were doing was so awful. It was because I felt I just couldn't measure up, and I was in some way holding them back. Even though I had been the golden goose and financed this thing for 15 years, I actually thought I was the dead weight holding it back. And that's kind of the mindset I was when I finally left. I thought I was doing them a favor to relieve them of this like turd that was holding them all back from doing something great.
Hoyt, how would you differentiate any religion from a cult? Say Christianity,
loaded question, Marty.
Christianity, Hinduism. I mean, well, we're talking about cult-like behavior, and you had mentioned that, and another part of this question would be, you'd mentioned that within your cult, you said we can see how outsiders would look at us and think we're a cult, but we need to stop our cult-like behavior. Was that to deceive or to recognize that maybe our behavior isn't right?
Well, good question. And I would say it was more to deceive because so much of the cultic indoctrination it's kind of like being pulled out of the matrix. All right. So you've been pulled out of the matrix, but everyone you're dealing with is still stuck in the matrix. So you have to deal with that matrix insanity from your point of view. So you try to minimize having to deal with the headaches of the matrix by recognizing everyone in the matrix is basically brainwashed and doesn't even know who they really are. But we know who we are, and we know where these enlightened beings are going to go to great things and yada, yada, yada. But the rest of the world is clueless. And that's why a lot of cults get up to some really law-breaking material, because they don't feel the rules of the world apply to them.
Which dovetails right perfectly into the question of how does that differentiate from any of the major religions?
And I think that's a very valid question of where you'd have to go kind of on a case by case basis. But I think, listen, you can make a very strong case that Catholicism is the biggest cult on the planet for centuries. And and that's not to say definitively it is, but you can make a strong case. And when you go down this path of starting to understand how these kind of cultic dynamics play out, I would say just in a current day situation, most people have had a cultic relationship with COVID. And the reason I say that is because people have ended up in very extreme positions. Some people, I'd say the majority of people either end up where it's the end of the world, or the other people are like, it's a hoax. So you have people in total terror and fear, of which I identify with, because when I was in the cult, we believed in a doomsday scenario coming forward. So for 20 years, I thought the end of the world was coming. So I knew how destructive that point of view was on my psyche. So when I during the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, when I walked out my apartment one day and I'm literally walking down the block, and I see someone like a block and a half away from another human, and he sees me, recognizes I'm a human, freaks out and bolts to the other side of the road. And I was like, Jesus Christ, it's not the zombie apocalypse. What is going on here? But the moment, the first thought that hit me is, man, that is an indoctrination process. You do not get there on your own. Someone gets you so freaked out that you get to that state of mind, because that's where I was for 20 years. So I recognized that what's happening and the way this thing is being handled is, I had one person say they called it the controller virus. And it's a massive control tactic that's gone on with this whole thing. And I just know that from knowing dynamics of manipulation and control. So that's where I really started to go, man, there's clearly agendas going on here that are not in the interest of getting people lots of information so they can critically think and make decisions for themselves. They're basically being guided through fear into certain behavior. And I think that's always very dangerous.
That's an interesting analogy. Hoyt, it is definitely time, and I think the listeners are dying to know a little bit more info about this specific cult that you were part of. Where was it located? How big was it? What were some of the tenets that he taught? How did he get you to start giving the organization so much money? Do you think you could give us a brief overview?
Sure. So the originally there wasn't a name. It eventually became named Eternal Values. All right. So, which is kind of catchy, but
sounds something worth getting behind.
Yeah.
Like,
right. I mean,
like a cologne in the 80s.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and for those on the inside, we called it EV. And Eternal Values was largely at the construction of this guy Freddie, and then he had a sidekick, this guy John Andreatis, and John was more or less around my age. Freddie was older than us, and John was like one of these just whiz kids. He had graduated from Columbia, and he had like a photographic memory, so he just recite scripture, and he was an incredible talker. They were all into astrology, and so they were trying to like kind of make forecasts, and Freddie plagiarized a lot from Edgar Casey, who was out of I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was the first one that kind of talked about these kind of doomsday scenarios coming, and this thing called the pole shift, which was this idea that, and apparently it has happened within the planet, because our planet wobbles, and at some point the wobble gets so extreme that the planet kind of connects itself. Yeah, recalibrates. Thank you. And it's like a 6-hour thing where literally the pole will shift down to like we're at the mid-Pacific, whatever, and then realign itself back up. And in that process, we'll wipe out virtually 99% of the population on the planet. So that's what Edgar Casey was forecasting, and Freddie jumped right on that. And so that was supposed to happen around the turn of the century. And that's a really good ticking clock to get people, to sign on. Basically, you can be part of the problem, or you can be part of the solution. Because time is. I met Freddie in the early '80s. That was only going to be 20 years before all this happened. So that's a good incentive to get people to kind of get off their butts. And the main tenet of the Eternal Values was actually a positive one, in the sense that it was trying to find the commonalities between religions rather than focusing on the differences. So we like I said, we looked at a lot of Eastern philosophy, mainly focusing on the Vedas. We also looked at Buddhism, and we looked at the Quran, and we looked at the Bible, and we tried to embrace all of them as best as possible. And
did you practice prayer, or were there any rituals that were commonly experienced?
We were supposed to read a lot, and I was never great at that. And that really kind of came back to cause a problem when my family tried to do an intervention. That's a whole other story. But so I wasn't like a great cult member in the fact of studying. I was much more into the kind of Star Wars take on that. We're up against these dark forces, and we're going to align it. We're going to become spiritual warriors, and we're going to go kick ass, and we're going to go help. We're the main. I laugh about it now. The main thing that Freddie was talking about, there was this pole shift that's going to happen. But if we did our work and we fulfilled our training, we were actually going to be lifted out by the space people. Now, when you hear space people, you have to chuckle. But I can also tell you that was so exciting to me that myself and no one else either. No one else ever asked, like, well, who are the space people and how we know we're the good ones, not the bad ones, type of thing. Like, it was all just like, they're space people and they're going to come get it? Awesome. Like, that's as far as the Inquisition went. So we were waiting for this grand opportunity, and a funny side note was, Freddie was very into health food and that sort of thing. But he was also really into being tan. In the 80s was when all those tanning machines came out. And so our entire group was just all tan all the time. Like, that was kind of one of that was a crazy ritual. And of course I was in the modeling business at that point, and I used to have, clients or even photographers or models say, like, hey, you're always so tan. Are you worried about ruining your skin down the road here? And in my mind, it's like, no, you guys don't understand. I'm going to be in the rejuvenation machine in the spaceship in 15 years. I got nothing to worry about. And that's literally how I look.
What did they have you reading, Hoyt? Or was it?
It was mostly the Vedas, the Hindu Vedas, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Yogananda, Sri Aurobindo.
And Freddie would interpret these for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Freddie and John would, yeah. And this is, like I said, those scriptures are incredibly valid and very inspirational. But if you looked at those scriptures and then matched it to the behavior that was going on in the group, it was absolutely hypocritical. It didn't add up at all. But it was all being put through that lens, like this was all this is all congruent and it was all in alignment, all these sort of things. And if you were seeing differences, it was because you were the problem.
Yeah, and when you said Heaven's Gate, you reminded me of, or when you said, I'm sorry, Space People, you reminded me of Heaven's Gate and the Hale-Bopp Comet.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I was literally sitting in an FBI squad area in Texas, and one of the guys was pretty devout Christian, and he was just mocking these people. And I said, dude, what is so different about their belief and about Moses raising his staff and parting the ocean?
Thank you, Britt. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean,
thanks, Britt.
That was Marty, by the way. I know. I usually have a little more timbre in my voice, according to AJ.
No, he is only allowed to think that I am the smartest, and if he thinks anything differently, he's out of the podcast.
Yes, thank you. No, but Marty, that is a question I get posed all the time, because again, it's like it's this heating up of the frog, right? If you go to the end of the journey where you hear all these extreme beliefs, everyone's like, "What are you, fucking nuts? How could you believe that?" Right? And they don't realize that it's very much a spoon-fed thing. And down the road, the extreme beliefs get kind of told to you in secret as a reward to being a good cult member. So the indoctrination is kind of rewarding you with it's kind of like you're being pulled further and further out of the matrix. So so you're actually gravitating towards these more extreme things, thinking you're, in quotes, freeing your mind, not realizing you're actually enslaving it. So, but the point being, even if you look at those extreme beliefs, which usually are quite ludicrous, you could easily make a case and compare it to anything in any other religion. Just they've been accepted for centuries. But if you actually look at them and look at this is that Noah got 2 of every animal and put them all in the ark and do this. Like, what are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I saw a great cartoon where this anteater's at the complaint department on the ark. He's like, "You're telling me there's only 2 ants on this whole boat?"
That's funny. Yeah. So on a personal level, Hoyt, so at the height of your involvement here, you're also at the height of your career. At the level you got to in that career, probably making 7 figures, at your top, and at the same time, deeply involved, separation from your family for quite some time, right?
Yeah, I didn't see my parents for, I think it was 12 years.
Oh my gosh!
And that was because they had tried to intervene, and you broke with them.
Yeah, I mean the group. Yes, I mean my family tried at times, and then my brother did an intervention which failed. But the group's definitely doing everything in its power to get you to separate from the family. It's very much kind of, you can look at it from the point of view of being told all the brainwashing you've experienced in your life happened before you met us. So now you're learning the truth, and we need to deprogram you from everything you've learned. And going back and trying to interact with those people is going to pull you back on these old ways that you're trying to get away from.
And you're funding the group at the same time, right? That was the point.
Correct.
The point of the amount you're making is you're handing your money over to them.
I was the cash cow. Yeah. I was the one that made the majority of the money, and then I was also unconsciously a recruiter. I pulled people into the group as well. People from my college, other models. That's one of the tough things about the recovery process is just those type of things. Like at the time, I thought I was doing everyone a solid, right? But I didn't know really. But those are the things you have to live with, which are some of the challenges of being a survivor. But it's the same sort of thing, what I call the ripple effect. I went through this experience, which was basically 20 years of my life. And yet anyone who cared about me, family or friends, got involuntarily taken on this journey with me. I mean, it's like having a drug addict in the family. You're watching someone you care and love about who's making choices, albeit maybe under severe influence, to a drug or to a group like that I was in. But they're clearly self-sabotaging and self-destructive, and you feel powerless to stop them. That's a pretty deep psychological wound you experience. And even in the best case scenario, and I would put my story in that, of where I came out of this thing, I figured out what it was. I went on a very aggressive self-education and recovery path, and now I've been like a cult survivor advocate and spoken out, about it for 2 decades. Even in that scenario, when I would go back to see friends and family, and they were always so concerned, like, are you doing okay? And I'm like, listen, I'm doing just fine, but how are you doing? Because I could see how wounded they were.
Yeah.
But because it's just that thing that we do as humans, that we did that revisionist thing of, even when you get to the point where things are okay, you still beat yourself up saying, if I had only done something earlier, maybe I should have figured this out. Like things that actually aren't accurate. And a lot of the conversations that I try to foster, even though they very often don't happen, is just trying to pass on some of these dynamics that were at play to say, listen, we were all way above our pay grade. It's nobody's fault. No one could have done anything. Like, we didn't know what we were up against. But if you can't have that conversation because someone's just too kind of wounded and unable or unwilling to deal with that trauma. And this is the thing I've learned in trying to tell the story and trying to reach back to some of the people that were in the group that still 20 years later are still indoctrinated, still stuck. Like, trauma does not go away, right?
Wow.
Trauma, it's like getting in a car accident. You're never going to forget you were in a car accident. But if you don't, in the case of something like this, if you don't have the humility to at least admit to yourself on some level that you got conned or taken up for a ride in some way, no healing takes place.
That's so hard. It's so hard, and I've seen it a lot just in law enforcement.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I forget what movie it was now, but it was hilarious to me. This guy, a super bright guy, he was being arrested for something, and he was being brought into the squad room, and he's having this inner dialogue. That's what you're hearing. He's like, I'm not going to tell these fucking idiots anything. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to talk. I don't need a lawyer. And he gets in there, and of course he spills his guts. And he comes out, and his friends are all like, dude, they do this every day. Get a lawyer, okay? You know, like you said, you're over your over your pay grade. It's nothing to feel guilty about. You're going to. You said it, like you said, it's a natural human emotion. But these con artists do it every single day. And I interviewed a con artist, a couple of them, but one guy, and the great thing about him from a law enforcement perspective is they're so confident that they just keep talking. And they finally talked themselves into a confession, or, they've inculpated themselves enough that, they get convicted. But they're good. I mean, they're good, and they will keep talking, and they're used to persuading people too. And so if you're sitting there on the other side and you're just kind of throwing out little things like, oh, I'm not quite sure about that. Well, what about that? They're like, well, and they're so intent on persuading you because that's what they do.
Well, that's right. And it's one of the things that it's not unlike serial killers in the sense that they refine their technique as time goes on. They get better at it. They keep taking in information and refining the approach. So, if they've been doing it for a while, they're very skilled. And it's also, it slips into this pathology, certainly with the cult leader model, so to speak. You're dealing with usually a person with narcissistic personality disorder. So they have an inability to ever take responsibility in any sort of conflict. They're always 100% the victim. And because of that, they also have an inability for empathy. They can never put themselves in someone else's shoes. So they're always maneuvering and trying to get the people around them to behave as they think they should behave, because they can't really see them as living, breathing, separate entities. They're all there to kind of maintain this false umbrella bubble that they live in where they're never wrong. And, the crazy part about the way the pathology plays out is as they get better at it and they start learning, like a good con man does, that lying, starts to blend with truth. And at a certain point, they can't tell. They're not giving off the signs that normal people do when they're lying, because they've kind of lost touch with that. The lines have all been blurred. And that's why interacting with them, you're not getting the normal signs that this person's really, really manipulating me. You're not picking those up for the most part.
It is fascinating to directly communicate with somebody with narcissistic disorder. And I mean, it's exhausting, but it's fascinating to watch them in a blink of an eye completely change their story and immediately believe that story is their new truth in order to justify their actions. And we saw this all the time with our former president as well, with his, I believe, obvious narcissistic disorder.
Sure. Well, I think most politicians have it. I would say Hillary, I think it's on both sides of the aisle. Hillary, completely the same way too, so that's why I have so little interest in politics, because to me, all I see is the deception and the corruption and the lying. Like, I think if you actually had any real moral compass or moral code, you'd be squeezed out immediately. Like, you can't, it seems to me, you can't get in that business unless you're compromised. And
it does seem like, generally speaking, in our society, politics has gone in a very cultish direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Marty. I mean, I would completely say that. I mean, there's no moderates, right? I mean, either you're far right or you're far left. I mean, it's just extremism.
Right. And if you're not part of our team, then you're part of the problem.
Right.
Some of the things you said really have reminded me of what I've heard a lot in modern day politics. So you, you've won. Sorry, go ahead, Hoyt.
No, I was just saying that, it's this type of thing that when you hear people, like if they're in one political stance, the moment they hear someone's the other point of view, they can't even hear what the person has to say. It's like they're blocking. It's like, oh, you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. Then it's like you can't. Once they've assessed that's who you are, then they can't even hear anything you're saying. And that's where I realized, like, this is cultic. That was the same way I was with my family. Once I had identified them to be the enemy, so to speak, I couldn't hear a word they were saying. Not a word.
And people have broken with their family over the last several years over politics. And that's the same way, right?
Well, yeah. And the QAnon thing's, been an example of that as well.
Sure.
Sure. So it's all over. That's why
people are hungry to believe things too, Hoyt, right? People, there's a void.
You're exactly right. Yeah. And it's one of the things I try to say. I think it's important to recognize, like, on a very core DNA level, we're kind of predisposed to follow. Like, we're a very social race. We find safety in numbers. So we kind of have this innate programming to follow. So if you want to become a leader in your life, or a leader of others, certainly, you have to first admit you've got this pre-programming that's something you have to identify and offset that will potentially get you in trouble because it's so ingrained. And I think if you don't recognize that, then quite often we're being manipulated all the time, and it just feels, that's just what we kind of know or feels familiar. As you learn in therapy, we constantly replicate familiar situations, even though they're massively unhealthy, but we're just familiar with it. So we think that's just where we're supposed to be.
So you touched on kind of the humility it takes then to take a look at your whole experience, really from age 16 on, and reframe it in differently than you had thought it was framed as you were living it. Right. At the end of the deal, you've been handing your money over. You have this highly successful career. You wound up head shaved and being berated and yelled at for like sometimes 10 hours a day by the group, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh yes.
And you leave not because they're the assholes, but you're the asshole in your mind. You're the one holding them back. But at some point you made a separation, and then you made a decision clearly that swallowing your pride and talking openly about this was part of your recovery.
Yeah, correct. I mean, it was for me personally, it was out of necessity. I've for whatever reason, I've been someone that much prefers transparency than deception, even if it's going to be embarrassing for me. I would rather just be upfront. And I think it was one of the hard things when I was in the cult was feeling like I was deceptive all the time. And what I mean by that is because I was living this double life where I certainly knew the rules that were kind of espoused within the group of how we were planning for this horrible thing that was happening in the future, and we could only trust the people in the group, and then everything else is kind of the people still stuck in the matrix of the dark forces, and you're constantly up against, because it's always very us versus them type of mentality, right? And so within that, anyone on the outside was considered to be dangerous. Now, because I'm the cash cow and I am literally on the road upwards of 300, sometimes 330 days a year for 10 years running, being Johnny Supermodel, I was out on my own a lot. And people would think, well, that must have been great. You weren't like under the pressures of the group 24/7. And in many ways, I did have freedoms, but in other ways, I was my own worst prison guard, because once you kind of know what the rules are and what you're supposed to do, supposedly on the outside, which is a lot easier to say when you're in the inside and basically living it 24/7 and only around people who are watchdogging each other. But when you're out there on your own, like I am, and I'm supposed to be living with those same values just on my own and having to call in every night and verify to them how I either succeeded or failed in living out my life in accordance to the principles that day. One of the things I would have to do is when I would make those phone calls with spin doctor that things were a little better that day than they may have been, because I know it's impossible to live the way these groups are at. And they're asking you to become these self-realized, enlightened people, which you can't do in the world. Like, it's just not realistic. So I was constantly having to lie to them about what had happened that day and try to save myself from not getting in more trouble than I could be. But then also I developed real friendships and love for people on the outside. I had friends from college, I had people from the industry, that I really thought were great people. And I just couldn't, in my heart of hearts, say, oh, these are terrible people and they all deserve to die at the end of the century here. So I had to lie to the group about the fact that I cared about those people. And simultaneously, those people, I'm not being truthful with them, that I'm involved with this group, that I think the end of the world is coming, all this crazy shit's happening. So I feel like I'm on some level being deceptive to everybody at all times. And that is like a little Pac-Man that eats at your soul. So for me, when I finally figured out what it was, and it's like anything, once you have the diagnosis, you can finally get the medicine. So for me, the diagnosis was I was in a cult, and not even a special cult. Like, I thought, oh my God, no one's ever going to understand this crazy story. And then I'm reading these books on cults. I'm like, check. Actually, I'm just textbook cult member here. There's really nothing special about anything I've gone through. But at least I knew I could get help at that point, and as hard of a pill that was to swallow. And this is what I'm saying. I've interacted with people now 20 years later that can't swallow that pill. And I had a conversation with one guy saying, he's like, he's taking the approach of, well, there were some things that weren't great, but it was basically amazing. My spiritual journey, I got things figured out. Frederick was this great teacher, and best thing could ever happen to me. I'm like, hold on. I said, listen, I'm not going to tell you that it was all bad, because it wasn't. There were some really good things. And it's one of the most important questions to ask anyone who's gone through an experience like this is, what made you stay? Because there always are some good things. But as I said to him, I said, when I look at Freddie as a person, he was very complex. I said, I don't think I'll ever figure him out, but I can certainly say from my point of view, one of his strongest characteristics was deception. And this guy's like, oh, what do you mean deception? I'm like, well, lied about his name. He lied about his whole background. He lied about, having a covert drug use. He had a covert sex life. He ends up getting AIDS, lies about that. As he's dying, we, as his loyal foot servants, are changing the wound of the bandage on his bed sore, because he's basically starving to death and potentially being in danger of contracting AIDS herself, because he's lied to us. And he goes, well, he was human. He was human too. I'm like, listen, bro, there are plenty of people that are human that don't do things like that. And they certainly don't call themselves spiritual leaders. So we're going to have to agree to disagree on this. And I could see, like, no one has pushed back on him in 2 decades, and he couldn't process it.
So is this cult still active, Hoyt?
No, it's not, because when I figured things out, and they were living in a house that I paid for, and they got businesses running that I had financed, and I can't even pay my rent. I was like, so I sued them under a RICO Act, and took them down, and they had to liquidate all that. So at that point, that was like 2002, it all kind of evaporated. But again, like I said, trauma left unhealed stays in place. And it is literally like going back in a time warp. When I've had to interact with these people, they are still stuck in it as if it was still going on.
So are they sort of disparate now, or are these people with whom you keep in contact, are they?
I've only reconnected with them because I'm trying to do, there's a project going on where we're trying to tell this story in a documentary format. And so it's only been through those interactions, and it's just been remarkable to just see how I can only describe it as being stuck. They're stuck, and where the rubber really meets the road is that humility. If you can't have the humility to really just face that there were things there that that don't per se look shine brightly upon you, then you literally stay emotionally stunted.
I absolutely love what you're saying and what you said. Trauma left unhealed stays in place. So talk to me about the process for you. You mentioned something about therapy. For me, leaving the Mormon church, it's been a years-long process. How long did it take you to accept that humility of your own naivete and what you went through? And what did you have to do to start healing from that?
Sure. Yeah. It started first with, and I think it's very similar to the recovery from addiction, where once I had acknowledged what it was, and I could take ownership, and I could say the word, that I was in a cult, and I was a cult member, whatever way. Then I went through what they would call the confessional stage, which was really interesting to experience, because as I was saying earlier, I felt like I'd been lying to so many people. I was so determined to tell the truth that it would just come out. I mean, I couldn't resist. Like, I would literally get in a cab in New York, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I need to go to 8th Avenue and 45th Street. Did I tell you I was in a cult? Yeah. No, really, 20 years. Really.
So you truth vomited all over the place.
Oh, everywhere, because I've been in a business where, I knew all about creating a facade, and like, this is the guy who would own the $3,000 suit. Oh, he looks like he belongs on a yacht. Oh, this. So I knew I had this costume that put off this image of something that I felt was so counter to what I felt inside. So I just, truth vomiting is exactly the way to describe it. And I initially kind of got off on the shock value of it, because people couldn't believe that I was using the word cult and claiming that I'd been in one. But then I learned over time that was not a very effective technique to have a constructive conversation. That was more just to kind of feel like I had taken some ownership over this experience that for so long I had hidden and never been forthcoming about. So that's where I started to do much more of the counseling and the self-education and learning, because it's through the self-education I was able to forgive myself for a lot of the things that had happened. And what I mean by that, it could be either things I said that I really cringed about, or things I didn't say when I really wish I should have, either things I did or that I didn't stop, all those sort of things. I mean, that is really the recovery process. It's starting to break all these things down, as well as the information I got exposed to. Like, I got exposed to a lot of really great information. I also got exposed to a lot of bullshit. And so that was the recovery process, was kind of going through the shades of gray and saying, you know what, I got exposed to this information or this kind of philosophy, and my life has actually been a great demonstration to prove that, I think that is pretty accurate of the way things are in life. Oh, I'm gonna keep that, in my kind of moral compass. And then there'd be other things going, hey, I bought into this. And like, there's nothing in my life that supports that point of view. That's a load of bullshit. And I would just cast it away. So that was kind of the process. And then, as I was saying, it was really important for me to not only be heard and trying to foster the conversation so it can be talked about, but also with my friends and family to try to facilitate at least the opportunity for some conversations that might allow some healing to happen, even though you learn very quickly you can't help or save anybody. People help and save themselves. But one of the ways they do that is through getting information. So I was like just trying to make it very clear to everybody that consider me a resource. And you want to ask me anything about my experience or what I've learned in recovering from my experience, please just ask. And that's really kind of where my focus has been over the last 2 decades. And it's like anything. I don't think recovery process is something you ever are over, because I'm learning all the time. And as I get new information I'm taking in, I self-reflect back on some of the stuff I went through. I'm like, oh, there's another way to look at that thing too. And there's actually, that might have been going on now. And so it's constantly evolving. And that to me is what's interesting. And that's ultimately what turned me into becoming a storyteller. I got so fascinated by story because I think story is the way we actually share our experiences and educate one another. I mean, you come home from work or whatever your day was, and you've got a loved one there, and you're like, oh, you're not going to believe it happened to me today. And you tell them the story. That's just what we do. And so when I was going through the recovery process, the therapist I was working with said, I would really advocate doing anything creative, because the creative arts allows you to take kind of accounting of whatever you're doing, whether it's writing or dancing or performing, painting, sculpture, whatever it may be. The lens you're using to create this thing is based on this biography. And part of this biography is this painful thing you went through. And as you start to recognize that painful thing you went through actually has become gasoline for this creative energy engine that allows you to create stuff that only you can create because of this unique lens you have from having lived the life you've lived. And that's a real confidence booster to say, oh, there is a method to the madness here. There is a reason I went through this that I can make peace on. And for me, and especially in the last 5 years, it's actually become a source of empowerment. I think enduring anything like I went through, and I'm sure you identify with this, Britt, like when you've survived something, you learn a lot of times you're a lot stronger than you ever give yourself credit for. But this experience taught you that you were able to handle something you never dreamed you could handle. And not only survive, but actually thrive, if dealt with. You can really, it can become something. So it's really going from victim to survivor to thriver. And I think that's something that we can all do in our lives. I really believe we've all been dealt a winning hand. You just have to learn how to play yours. And that's really how I look at it.
You know what I'm not hearing when I'm listening to you, Hoyt? I'm not hearing bitterness. And I think that's where some people get stuck when they've gone through something traumatic, just like what you said, victim to survivor to thriver. It sounds like you have gone through such a beautiful process, and I'm seeing you at the end building upon what you've gone through, building upon what you've experienced, and finding a place where you can thrive, and you've been able to forgive not only the people who manipulated you, but especially, as you said multiple times in this podcast, forgive yourself for buying into it in the first place. And because you've been able to forgive yourself, you've been able to let go of the bitterness that you probably definitely held for a while, and take all the good that you heard. And now it looks like you're building a great life upon that.
Well, that's very, very sweet of you, Britt, and thank you. But it's something I've even learned with my parents. I mean, as I went down the path of storytelling, I had a great mentor that said the backstory is always the story. And what he was saying by that was that we all get wounded in different times in our life, and then we develop coping mechanisms to deal with that wound or not deal with it, whatever way we've gone with it. Most of us choose not to deal with a lot of our wounds. So we build these coping mechanisms to kind of get us by, again, get us to survive through whatever we need to survive through. And then a lot of times in stories, where you're entering the story is where this individual the coping mechanisms have now become the problem. And it's because the wound really hasn't been healed.
Mm-hmm.
So, I had a very, very dominant, strong-minded, moralistic mother. We had a very confrontational relationship. And I think one of the things that really is a great asset for anyone in a family who certainly had issues, like with a parent or both, is you have to investigate the backstory, because it's so easy as a child to enter the picture when you were born and look at the years since then and have all sorts of gripes against your parents of what they did or didn't do or what they said or didn't say, and all this resentment built up. But I also like to look at it as if we all kind of enter the world with this huge toolbox, all sorts of great stuff. But then as crises occur and as shit hits the fan, we have to pull out tools, and sometimes we lose them because the crises demand so much. And by the time you've gotten married, you've lost plenty of tools just to kind of get to that point. And so as a kid, you may be like, Dad, I need the hammer. It's like, listen, the toolbox is, there's no hammer. But I got the wrench. I'll give you the wrench. I don't want the wrench. I want the hammer. You go, no, the wrench is the next best thing. And you hate your dad because he never gave you the hammer. Now, if you do the backstory, you go like, oh shit, he never had the hammer because he lost it back at that time. And he's right. The wrench was the next best thing. Oh, and you can change your whole point of view on your parents or anyone by doing that. I think it's so important to take the time to investigate the backstory.
That's great.
And that's what humanizes everybody. And that's why you can't, like, even, I could demonize Freddie left, right, and center, but he was just an ill guy, very complex, ill guy. And I can certainly say without a lot of problem that he died a really slow, painful death. And I don't have a problem with that either.
Right.
But I also don't give him the power to say he was this evil, mini Hitler, like the same thing like a Hitler, whatever. All these people, if you humanize them, you're better off to recognize those people when they show up rather than paint them in these extreme pictures. And people just don't show up like that. They're much more subtle. They're much more, kind of charismatic. They don't, as much as I've learned about narcissists and everything, I still interact and find myself like, oh my God, I'm involved with another fucking narcissist again. I will say I've gotten faster at identifying it,
right?
But it still happens. Like it's just seems to be part of the road we walk. And but that's the part of it that I find the fascinating thing. This delving into this experience to try to make sense of my own life has given me this approach and perspective to look at life that I'm grateful for. I basically tell people like, oh, what about all the money? I'm like, listen, School of Hard Knocks. I wouldn't recommend you taking the courses I took. They were fucking expensive. You're right. But if that's what it took to get me to where I am now, so be it. Because I'd rather be here than clueless like I was back then and have the money.
That's such a healthy perspective, man. And so if somebody has a loved one that they're concerned about or suspect they're in a cult or something, like, what do they do? Is there anything you can do, or is that person eventually, does that horse have to decide to drink the water?
No, you can. I'm fortunate now that I got to know one of the top cult experts in the country. He actually wrote the book that was the book I first read. His name's Steve Hassan, Dr. Steve Hassan. Now he's got a doctorate from Harvard, but he does interventions in cases like that, and I work with him occasionally. When it works, when he thinks I'll be an asset to the case. So I'm actually now on the other side of helping families get their kids out of these situations. Mm-hmm. So you can call people like that. There's also
what's the name of the book, Hoyt?
Combating Cult Mind Control, by Steve Hassan, and in a crazy full circle, that book, which is the one my mother had read that book. I read that book when I figured it out. Like it's like the kind of the first and best book on that subject matter. He just did a new edition of it, a couple of years ago. And now my story is in that book as one of the cult stories. So it's been interesting to kind of come full circle that way. And a lot of what I do in this area is just to make it hopefully cooler to talk about your cultic experience, because I believe in my heart that we're all having them. I went through an extreme version, but we're all having them. And that's why I said, like I was saying earlier, if we don't start to understand and speak the same nomenclature and lexicon, there's a lot of common ground for us, not only to learn and heal from, but to also find some real commonality and kinship and support in trying to make sense of these type of relationships.
Yeah, Hoyt, have you ever? I made all my nieces who are in their 20s now. I made them all watch this Netflix series, at least the first one, called Serpent.
Oh, I've heard about it. I haven't seen it yet. Yeah,
it's so that cultic bit like behavior, and I remember what my niece was. She was traveling in southern Turkey somewhere, and she was working with this guy, and I said to this guy, I said, listen, I'm holding you personally responsible for her safety. I can't stop her from going over there, because I thought southern Turkey was kind of a dangerous place. This is just like a year or two ago, and then that guy literally called me and said, hey, I've got your niece and an Austrian gal working with me, and they're going to do something like just friendly, just somebody offers some friendly
go out for a good time,
go out for a party or a club, and he's like, this is not, and I know from my background in law enforcement that a lot of these people will plant people in these hotels and these positions to lure in young gals, especially,
right?
And so I called her right back and said, stop. First of all, do not do that, and explained it to her. But it reminded me of the Serpent, and then I called him, and he, they were all, I think, at the end of their work relationship. But I said, okay, then now she's not going out. I said, you're personally responsible to get her to the closest airport, and he said, okay, that'll be Istanbul in 2 days. And I said, okay, after that, then she's, and then of course she calls me and she goes, oh, Uncle Marty, I left my retainer in Serbia, so I'm going to go back. Well, Serbia's not that dangerous right now, but I'm like, just honey, please come home or go to. She's like, well, I'm going to London after this. I'm like, well, all right, just.
How come you never told me to watch an episode of Serpent? I'm vulnerable too at times.
You're very vulnerable. You are the serpent.
Hoyt, thanks so much for joining us and telling your story, man. I mean, like I said, when I first met you through Joel, I mean, as soon as, obviously you're a personable guy and just in and of itself, but as soon as, I can't remember how it came up, but when it came up that you'd been in a cult and escaped the cult, I mean, as far as I was concerned, everybody else could have disappeared at that moment. I was like, I want to talk to you for several hours, one-on-one right now.
Because he's got something for you to believe.
That's right. Because they were wrong, but my way's right. No, it's just, I find that your whole story, your background, it's kind of like, I mean, you're just a kid on the beach meeting someone, a teenager. You're an athlete at Princeton. You go on to a successful modeling career, like all these markers of intelligence, of success. Like, okay, how could you get duped? But it's anybody. Like you said, we're all human.
Yeah.
And Margaret Singer, one of the things she said was, there's no one personality type that, that can get drawn into these. It can happen to anyone. And I've seen it happen to, maybe the cultish behavior, just being conned from the top of highest levels that people would attach to society to the bottom. People get sucked into these things. It just it happens.
It's kind of a perfect storm is the way I describe it, because mind control will work on everyone, but you have to be receptive to it. So the way I like to kind of frame it is, at that time, at 16 on the beach when I meet this guy, I didn't really have a game plan. And most 16-year-olds don't. But on some level, I felt like I did. I should have one. And a lot of that was because a lot of things came easy for me. I did well at school. I was a good athlete. I had a lot of friends. A lot of things that others struggled with in those teenage years, I was handling fairly well. But I had no passion, no thing that I was really going for other than like scoring touchdowns and chasing girls and drinking beer, And so, but
they're not bad goals. I mean, really.
Well, yeah.
Think about it. Just kidding. Just kidding.
But that was the hook of him saying, "Do you think you've been given these gifts so you can just have a more lucrative or easy life?
Right?
Have you ever considered that maybe you've been given these gifts so you could do something positive with it for others?"
Which, goddamn it, is a valid question. Like that's
right.
That's a freaking. I mean, that is a valid and I would say healthy question to ask a person.
But the vast majority of these conspiracies and con men, 80% of what they say is true.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
That's the hardest part of disproving it is it's like, there's a lot of truth laced in there.
Yeah. Well, that's it, and it's our nature. If we've encountered someone and from our point of view they seem to be espousing truth, then we very often make the mistake of saying, "Oh, they're a truth teller," and now we just trust everything they say.
Yeah.
Right. Well, go ahead, Hoyt.
No, and I'm just saying it's an unconscious thing that happens, and so like I tell people all the time, I will never beat myself up for what I signed up for. It was a really great, wonderful idea that a lot of people would, basically the idea was turning my back on my selfish hopes, dreams, and ambitions for one lifetime and really serve God and a greater cause.
Yeah.
Well, we had I was going to say we didn't have Malcolm Gladwell on our show, but we had a show talking about his book, Talking to Strangers, and just as the human species, you're inclined to believe. It's more efficient from a Darwinian perspective to believe.
Yeah. And what a nice thing to believe in, that you're serving a greater truth, a greater good, not just selfish, and it seems like in the end, through it all, you, and it's something that I see in Britt also, have come to this pretty healthy place where you've been able to decide on the things you want to reject. And I'm sure that's an ongoing process, but also embrace the things that you feel are positive. I've heard Britt say that even about Mormonism, that there's certain aspects to community that they do really, really well,
Sure.
And so as much as you can, you pick and choose. Obviously, you can't have one foot in, one foot out.
And that's why when you tell these stories, it's really important, like I said earlier, to ask that question, what made you stay? Because the question that normally gets asked, which is really inappropriate and really insulting, is why don't you just leave?
Yeah.
Right.
And that statement, first of all, just putting the just in front of, as if it was easy. Like it's showing how ignorant you are of the subject matter to even say that. And the only thing I could compare it to would be, say, in a very vulnerable moment, I said to you guys, listen, when I was 21, I was raped. And then one of you turns and says, "Well, what were you wearing that day?"
Right.
Gross.
Well, it's
that makes me so angry.
Yeah.
Putting it on you as if you had the power solely.
Well, it's a good thing we didn't ask him why you didn't. It's a good thing we didn't ask you why you didn't just leave, Hoyt.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, it's like leaving an abusive relationship. It's too simple. It's too simple to say that.
Of course.
It's a very similar dynamic. That's why I say those are cultic relationships.
Yeah, that's a concept I hadn't heard before. By the way, that cultic relationships
and I think it helps frame the cultic model that way because the only difference of what I went through is you have this cultic relationship, but then there's a peer pressure element because there's a group involved. So that makes it more intense. And instead of just one person you're trying to make happy, in our group, it was assumed like the fate of the world lies in balance. So it's like that cultic relationship all dialed up on steroids because the stakes have gotten so much higher now.
Well, right. And comparing this to mainstream religion is a really interesting question to me. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I will say that one of these cult experts that spoke to our task force did mention I think it was he. I don't know if it was Margaret or not, but they said that hey, if an idea like say mainstream Christianity, not like the Branch Davidians or someone like that, but survives 3 generations, then there's something okay about it. And that doesn't mean it's all true, or that, that all the Abrahamic religions are true, or all the Eastern religions are true. It just means that there's something solid. Maybe there's a solid core to it. So I just don't want all my Christian friends to get mad at me and
sure,
and calling them automatons.
Yes. No,
it's just it is an interesting question. It's one I had too,
No.
Marty.
Right.
It's where's the line? It's clearly not a clear line between mainstream religion and quote unquote cults.
So.
However, there are very clear. I think there are very clear distinctions that not clear distinctions, but I think there are obvious distinctions that you can make between a cult and a healthier religion.
Mm-hmm. But then what's a healthier religion and what's a not a healthier? Because sometimes,
right?
all the, and you mentioned it, Hoyt, the Scientology, right? And there was over the past several years, the documentary and the book, and Scientology's caught a lot of heat. And I think rightly so, seemingly, from what I understand. But then there's a part of me that also says, well, if it works for some people, if they're not hurting anyone, and if it works for some people to feel empowered and make their life better, then I'm like, if you're not getting hurt and you're not hurting someone else, then I'm all for it. But I guess that could be maybe a distinction without a difference. So
I mean, I think you have to go case by case. It's because depending on how deep or not someone is involved with like a Scientology, they get a vastly different experiences. Someone on the peripheral may not have any overt extreme control happening where people get more intimately involved.
Then it gets heightened.
And some of them,
there's always money. The money is extraordinary.
That's a red flag, right?
Yeah.
And some of the brightest, kindest people I know are Christians, and I even had a Jesuit great uncle who was a priest, and I remember he had long wavy white hair, big blue eyes, and he was a scholar. He did the debating circuits in Europe, and I remember I thought I was a smart little 17-year-old, and I said, come on, I'm looking at the Bible, I'm like, you don't expect me to believe this stuff, do you? And he kind of looked, whenever he was going to be a reverend, he'd look over his shoulder and say, listen, lad, don't tell the Pope I said this. But a lot of what you read in there is bullshit. And it's like, his Christian, here's a priest, and his version of Christianity was keep loving your heart and you'll be just fine. And I look at someone like him and say, okay, Christianity's good, or at least his version. But I get a different answer from almost everyone I ask, what is Christianity? From Christians that I ask, what is Christianity? Now we're going down the rabbit hole, so I'll let AJ pull us back. But they're like they're all sort of
there's blurry lines,
cases,
right? Even with you, Britt, and Mormonism, somebody could have said, well, why don't you just leave long before you were ready to? When you're dealing with all this patriarchy and people holding you down, you're such a strong personality and such a light wanting to shine, but the whole structure is like holding you down as a woman at the very, to simplify it.
Yes, and there's a lot of shame pressure.
Why don't you just leave? Why don't you just take the hijab off? It's her choice. She wears it because she wants to, sure. Or she takes it off and she loses contact with everyone she's ever known in her life.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not a real choice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Anyways, we could talk for another 2 hours, Hoyt, with you. And, wish you luck on these projects that you're working on, man.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Keep us in the loop, and certainly we'll hear through Joel where those are, and looking forward to seeing you the next time you come up.
Well, absolutely, and you guys you're a great triad. You guys all have some wonderful perspectives to share.
I like to call us a threesome, Hoyt.
Oh, do you?
I love it when she says that too.
All right, I like it.
Does that make me a bad person? Hey, it was great meeting you too, and I look forward virtually. I look forward to meeting you when you get up here, and thanks for everything you're doing.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story, Hoyt.
My pleasure.
Usually when AJ wraps it up like this, it's because he has to pee. So okay. I thought you'd want to know that. He's going to probably edit that part out, but we'll see. We'll see about that. We'll see how transparent he is.
I appreciate being added to the threesome for a couple hours. That's nice.
You got it.
All right, Hoyt.
Take care, you guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.